Yes, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. Um, Let me share my screen. Yeah, so can you guys see it?
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
Just a second. There we go. Okay, so let's get on to it. I've decided to talk, I've decided to name my PhD progress talk, A Convergence of Realms, Ontological and Formal Reflections on the Mind-Matter Dualism. So what I'm going to talk about is basically, as my PhD is still on its initial stages, I'm going to talk about the work that I have done up until now, and how did it lead, how did it get to the PhD proposal that I'm presenting. So first of all, I wanted to start with a story about the two realms. Okay, so this is a historical story. So what I want you to do is to try to imagine how would it be for ancient and for Greek antiquity or uh, for uh, for older times to try to look at the sky without knowing all the things we know about it. And probably what we would see there is that there's this celestial bodies that no matter how much time pass by, we still see the same in the sky, right? So we've got the stars that, if we look at them, they do these circular movements, and for the hundreds of years of records they had, this had done the same thing over and over again. But if we look around ourselves, below the skies, what we would see is that things that change. So we see people that are born and people die, and we see how empires arise and get into wars and then they disappear. And we see the creations of nature appearing and falling apart. So it is just natural to think that there's some different laws that govern things that happen on the skies and things that happen beneath. So it was not Aristotle the first to think of this, but he might be the one that phrased it or described it in better terms. So Aristotle thought of the world as divided in these two realms. He called these two realms the supralunary world, where the eternal, static, and divine objects are, and which has these properties. And then he thought of the sublunary world, right? So this is where the ephemeral, dynamic, and corruptible things are. And for Greek antiquity, these two domains of reality were actually totally divided. So they did not think that they could in any ways converge. And they thought that it was different laws, right, that governed the supralunary world and the sublunary world. Yeah. And by this division of these ontological realms, the entirety of pre-modern thought and pre-modern science was constructed. So this idea of heaven and earth is basically a reformulation of this cosmology, or for example, the medieval distinction of trivium and quadrivium is, so to say, the study of discourse and things that are subject to change, such as grammar, dialectics, and rhetoric. And the quadrivium is the study of the eternal objects of arithmetics, geometry, music, and astronomy. But so we've got some historical development, and once again, it is not Newton the first one to say this, but he's the first one to actually find the laws that describe the movement of planets, right? And the surprising or the revolutionary thing is that these laws that he describes, these laws that he thinks to describe the movement of planets, appear to be the same laws that describe the movement of the objects below. So this implied that this division of ontological realms, this division of a domain which has separate laws from the domain below, is just shattered into pieces. So with Newton, what I think is the deep revolution is precisely this, that he breaks apart this distinction of realms. But then comes Descartes. And Descartes poses the question, okay, but what now? Because, okay, so that's fine that we have the same laws that govern the movement of objects, right? But where do these eternal, static, and divine things go? Because what it is true is that we need them. It is the only certain thing from which we can start to describe our world. So what he does is, instead of just trying to merge these two domains, he places one domain inside the mind, and he places the other domain outside the mind. So this is the res cogitans and res extensa, right? Which have these similar properties to this previous distinction of the sublunary world and the supralunary world. And this leads to an ontology that we quite well know, right? Now, can you see my mouse, people?
Yeah.
The pointer? Yeah,
Yes.
okay. So this leads to the ontology that we know quite well, the world as a deterministic mechanism, the extensive world as a deterministic mechanism, an epistemology that sees knowledge as a representation of the physical world, right? So the knowledge as representation in the mind of the extensive stuff. And then modern philosophy turns into a dialectic between reason and experience. And so does knowledge. So on the one hand, we are going to have sort of the sciences or the study of reasoning, arithmetic, algebra, geometry, grammar, logics, syllogistic logics. And on the other hand, we're going to have the study of experience, natural sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, and so on. Okay. So if we keep going on with this story, we reach to quite recent discoveries, quite recent breakthroughs in science. So on the one hand, we have the history of thought. So I have named it, but we can think of it in many different ways, and it's just not this, but this is just a part of it. But I think it is very important for what we are going to talk later. And I'm just going to go through it because so Kiko's talk the previous seminar was basically, was very related to this. So I'm just going to go through it, okay? So we've got symbolic algebra that turns into symbolic logic and then into predicate logic. This allows to the search for mathematical rules of logicism, but they come to these paradoxes which they cannot go over, and this transforms then into study of meta logic, to the study of logic itself. Thanks to these developments, we come to descriptions of what computation is, what calculation is, and then its practical applications onto computers and to the theory of communication that we have today, maybe up to LLMs, right? Maybe up to what we know today of computer science. On the other hand, we have another history of the study of matter, not all the history, but just part of it, which I've decided to just organize in classical thermodynamics, then turning into stochastic thermodynamics with Boltzmann and some other scientists, and then the field of mechanical statistics that allows to study dynamics in natural phenomena with these specific tools. And on the other hand, nonlinear dynamics that allows to study nonlinear processes and interactions that lead to complex dynamics and attractors and these other concepts that then are incorporated into systems theory, and together with non-equilibrium thermodynamics, they somehow lead to the complex science, complex system science that we know today, right? But it is with these people, not only these people, but it is by means of them that we come to what I think it's the most important revolution, scientific breakthrough of the last century, which is how cybernetics allowed us to finally, by scientific means, make the synthesis of these two spheres, mind and matter, right? So cybernetics is the first formal description of the observer inside the system and not outside the system. And the system, the observer thought of as being a self-organizing feedback communication system. So we have to understand that this synthesis has profound consequences, right? Because we have to understand that it means that it breaks how we have seen the world from the entirety of Western scientific history and philosophical history. So it is a reconceptualization of basically our entire system of thought. And Umberto Maturana, Francisco Varela, Jean Piaget, and Heinz von Foster knew this, so they tried to put forward an answer, and they tried to put forward an ontology and epistemology that reconceptualize all this history of thought, right? And the proposal was radical constructivism, which is maybe the last comprehensive proposal in these terms. But so for historical reasons and for some other reasons, the proposal did not have as much attention as it could have had. Maybe the focus were somewhere else. And so here we are, right? So we all know that we all know the state in which complex system science is right now, in which there's very promising breakthroughs, but we are building over categories that are still let's say, that are still dualistic or that still operate within these ontological terms, which are not strictly coherent with what we want to do, right? So here we come to my master's thesis. So for the master's thesis, I wanted to address this topic precisely. So I look for this person here, who is Jordi Claramonte. He's a philosopher that works, he's a professor that works at the Distance University of Spain. And he works on model aesthetics. But he has worked on model aesthetics precisely investing his time and devoting his research to this abyss between the mind and the body through complex systems theory. So I asked him to work on my master's thesis under his guidance, and he accepted. So that's what I did. And I wrote my master's thesis, which was my first personal attempt to make this systematization, right, or to work on this systematization. And some references that are going to be familiar for most of you, I think. It's, first of all, complex systems theory, non-equilibrium thermodynamics, and stochastic thermodynamics. In logic, Spencer Brown, Tarski, and Quine. On cybernetics, von Foster, Maturana, Varela. On process ontology, Whitehead and Bergson. On biosemiotics, Terence Deacon and Jacob von Uxküll. On generative grammar, Chomsky, Ignacio Bosque. And on relational linguistics, Saussure and Gadamer, among others. So the result is what at the time is called Extended Theory of Language Project, but the name might change next week. The important thing is that we call it the project. And so the project consists on trying to understand the world as communication processes articulated through a multiplicity of stratified languages. Now, I'm going to explain all this because just by saying this, there's very little that can be understood. But the first thing is to note that when we say language, we do not mean human language, at least not exclusively. So later I will explain what we mean by language. And right now it's an ongoing collaborative process. It is a group of people, of friends that we gather from time to time, and we have these informal meetings, and we discuss about the topic, and we have these heated conversations where we elaborate ideas and when we try to give form to this project. And I also use this space to say that for any of you who come to visit to Madrid, you're invited to join. We love having new people come to join us and discuss about it. And it is this group, a very diverse group of people from very different areas. And there's people from linguistics, there's people from natural sciences, there's people from philosophy. Yeah, so you're invited. And that's how we come to the PhD. So in the PhD, the idea is to take a minimal part of this scheme and try to formalize it and to apply it to a specific case. So in order to explain what this is about, I'm going to explain that specific minimum part of the scheme. So I want you to understand that there's this going to not explain, so there's many gaps, but I invite you to you can ask me for the master's thesis where there's more in-depth explanation, or just wait for some future I don't know, publications or ways in which we will get to know what the work is going, where the work is going into. So let's take it where we left it, okay? We said that the history of thought had taken us to the theory of communication.
Marco, can you hear me? I think I have the last slide, extended theory of language, kind of freezed in my screen. Yeah.
Yeah, same.
Thank you, Sukiko. What do you see now?
No,
Has
still extended theory of language.
It might help, Marco, if you turn your camera off. Sometimes that helps with the... I'm not sure exactly what it is, but I know sometimes it helps.
Did it change?
No, maybe you should refresh or and share again. Yeah.
Okay, now you see me, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, let's try again. Thank you, Sukiko, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, is it now?
Yeah.
And it changes? Yes, right? Does it?
Yeah, we see the new slides. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, well, so sad that that you were not seeing this beautiful landscape. Okay, so I continue then. So we had left it here, right? We had left our story here. We have this history of how formal or research, but also thought in us to the theory of communication and all these things, right? And on the other hand, we had the history of matter that had led us to system theory and complex systems theory and so on and so forth. And so The idea, the starting point of the proposal was to try to understand the profound consequences, like the most fundamental proposal, the most fundamental departing point of these two traditions, right? So on the one hand, we have the theory of communication, or we have the computation, and it reaches a point in which it realizes that from a very basic distinction and some basic rules of transformation, some isomorphic transformations, you can actually reconstruct any language, right? So this is what basically a computer is. So you've got this basic distinction, the zeros and ones. And from basic rules of transformation, basic rules of transformation, you can reconstruct any language, no matter how complex. On the other hand, we have complex system theory and thermodynamics, where you can think of organization and fluxes of matter due to asymmetries, right? Gradients, so to say. So when we try to understand in the most fundamental consequences, what thermodynamics says is that if you have this, that you can reconstruct any complex process from fundamental asymmetries or gradients and some restricted dynamics. So we started from this point. So we said, okay, this is suspiciously similar. This is suspiciously equivalent. So we did the exercise of, we tried to put forward this ontology that would start from this point. So that would start just from a basic distinction and some restrictions which are basically isomorphic transformations. And this led to the idea, so on the one hand, we have this theory of language, and on the other hand, we have this theory of dynamics of phenomena, right? So we thought of reconceptualizing both of them by means of some joint dynamics of linguistic processes. Okay. So let's see what distinction means.
Sorry, Marco, can you
Once again?
go back? Yes, because I didn't. Yeah, can you please repeat your explanation here? Because it was difficult to follow. Sorry.
Yes. So the idea was that we were trying to find the common ground, okay, from which to start. And for the basic principle, or basic, the fundamental principle from which both computer theory and complex system theory, or thermodynamics in a way, had reached. And the idea was that this was distinctions together with some basic rules of transformation. So we thought, okay, what if we use this, what if we try to reconstruct both of these domains by starting from point, not having to describe them in terms of, reconceptualize them in terms of distinctions and restrictions in what we thought of dynamics of linguistic processes, which we're going to explain now.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so the idea of distinction. So in these terms, distinction is we are going to say fundamental principle, or we are going to say it's the starting point. So a distinction is, in very basic terms, the possibility to tell apart something that it is from something that it is not. And this can be in any manner. So, for example, well, some examples of distinction, we can basically think of anything. But as I have said, an example of distinction is the possibility to tell apart a 0 from a 1, current from no current. It doesn't matter what it is, but it is just the possibility of telling apart something that it is from something that it is not. It can also be a gradient in the electromagnetic field. It can be a difference in color, in shape, in frequency. It can be basically a distinction on anything. So anything that we can think of or anything that we can speak of must be distinct, for otherwise we could not talk about it or we could not think about it. So the precondition for existence, or the precondition to bear any meaning, is to be distinct. Right? So this is the definition. And we have to understand as well that whenever we speak of a distinction, there's also a form. They are complementary concepts. So if there is a distinction, there is a form, right? So we are going to use it in almost equivalent terms. Okay. The next thing is that distinction creates the possibility for change. And in this case, change implies a change in form. So we are going to call this a transformation. So the etymology says everything. Transformation. I know this to the situation of thermodynamics in terms of any this tends to dissolve, right, in some different terms. And now we come to this. Okay, I'm going to read it and then I'm going to explain it. Change of form is given by discrete modal instances in which objectified forms are actualized through the creativity of occurring forms into potential field forms, the act of any case. Unveil what this means right now. Do you see the new slide?
No. No. And your voice continues breaking down somehow. Yeah. I think maybe, as Matthew suggested, if you switch off your camera, you can maybe.
Yeah, okay, let's see. Let's share the screen once again.
I should say that the sound is breaking down for me as well.
It might be my internet. I don't know. It's supposed to be good, but who knows? So far, well, right now, do you hear me properly?
Yep.
Yes.
And we see the slides here.
Okay. Please just, if it stops to be understandable, just please stop me and tell me. Okay. So we come to the act of communication. Okay. So we've said that basically it is a transformation. So we get from an initial form that it's transformed into a final form. So the act of communication is in the act of communication, an initial form is transformed into a final form by an agential form, by an agent, through some linguistic operations. So what is an agent? We are defining an agent as that form which has an internal structure in a given language that persists in time after the transformation. And then the act of communication is a discrete process of 3 primary stages. And we can think of these stages as the basic description of, in biological terms, right? So we have, first of all, reception. So there's a distinction, there's an input from the environment, which the agent has sensibility. Then there's a transformation, which depends on the internal structure of the agent. And then there is an effection, there's an output. So the agent affects something onto the environment. And so the basic scheme is this, right? So this initial form, there's this initial form, which is transformed into a final form through a series of linguistic operations, so through a series of transformations that depend on the internal structure of the agent. Now, depending on the agent's internal structure, it can be linear or circular. Transformations can be transitive or reflexive. So transitive transformations are a series of internal acts of communication in which no resulting form is dependent on itself. And a reflexive transformation is a series of internal acts of communication in which at least one resulting form is dependent on itself. So this leads to the division of transitive agency and reflexive agency. So in transitive agency, we have this input, which is translated by some syntactic rules into an affection. But if we have reflexive agency, there's a more complex process in which this syntactic structure is then interpreted by means of references to internal representations of the word. And then this other part we are going to explain later. So, okay, so the act of communication is articulated through the particular languages of the external form and the gensel form. So let's see what we mean by language then. So the definition of language in these terms is that the resulting complex productive structures of forms consisting on a lexicon, set of symbols, a syntax, combinatory rules, semantics, external references, pragmatics, effective practices. Well, here it's needed a more in-depth explanation, but for reasons of time and space, we are going to just leave this here. But once again, it's important to say that it does not refer to human languages. So there is the electromagnetic subatomic language, which has its lexicon, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. There's the genetic molecular language, there's the binary computational language. And for example, there's the Mercedes-Benz production factories operational language, right? So it's the lexicon, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics of a certain process. Now, every linguistic operation has 4 modal aspects: landscape, repertoire, disposition, and attunement. So landscape is the modal category of effectiveness, and this pertains to the past trajectories that set the actual initial conditions. Then the repertoire is a modal category of necessity, and it pertains to the restrictions that set the boundary conditions of a process. Then there is the disposition, which is the modal category of possibility, which pertains to the allowances that set the phase space of a process. And finally, attunement is a modal category of likelihood, and it pertains to the predispositions that set the probability distribution of a process. So now if we come back to this representation, to this scheme, we have the landscape, which is the external objectified effective forms, which have certain distinctions imprinted on it based on what the trajectories that have already happened. And then we have an agent which is sensible to these distinctions and which translates it by some syntactic rules, which are then make references to the internal representations. Now, these internal representations have some boundary conditions given by the repertoire, within which there is the phase space. There is different possible interpretations, and each of which has a different likelihood, right? So using Michael Levine's terms, the agent is going to navigate these linguistic spaces until it finds until it converts to a certain trajectory, it converts to a certain interpretation, which is then going to be valued. This is the color. It's going to be valued, and then it's going to make predictions of the external environment, of the external world. And once again, there's going to be some boundary conditions given by language within which there's a phase space, which is going to navigate until it converts to a solution. And based on these predictions, it's going to form an intention, which is going to translate by some syntactic rules to some affection on the landscape by means of exerting a distinction on the landscape. Okay, are slides changing now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, good.
Okay. So we come to the idea of a process. Now, the idea of a process is a series of acts of communication that have a consistent linguistic structure. So the same as, because it is a series of acts of communication, it can also be transitive or reflexive. So this would be the scheme, right, of a transitive process and of a reflexive process. Now, this is just an example for a scheme. Of course, it can have any shape in any, let's say, any arrangement. And like the act of communication, processes are going to have boundary conditions that set the phase space, which are going to have different likelihoods and which are going to converge into different trajectories, which are going to be affected onto the landscape, right? And so transitive processes naturally evolve to the most likely dispositions. This is what we said before about the dissolution of the form, dissolution of distinction. Distinctions tend to disappear. But we know that reflexive processes can evolve to an unlikely disposition and can grow in complexity. So the more restrictions a language has, the more expressive power. But the lesser restrictions a language has, the more expressive ambiguity, that is, the more creativity. So reflexive processes in the balance border of chaos are stable enough to maintain a certain structure, but are creative enough to yield emergent forms, right? And these emergent forms do not belong to the internal language of the process in which it has been formed. And this is what explains, what time is it? How much time do we have? Okay. And this is what explains, this is what allows us to explain how do we get from very simple forms, transitive agents, such as, so let's say a rock, okay, until complex, very complex structures, very complex agents, such as human beings, right? And so the idea is that this internal reflexive structure can be in itself a reflexive process. It is indeed a reflexive process, right? So we can have this fractal behavior in which there's an indefinite amount of times in which you can zoom in and find that the internal structure is a series of reflexive processes. And in each of them, what we get is some new language with its lexicon, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics, but which all of them have to work in a coherent way to yield a certain result, because the result out of the agental form is just one result, right? So they all must convert to the same result, even though they are different languages. And this is what Chomsky, we've related this to what Chomsky named the deepest structure. So the lower strata determines the modal aspects of the surface structure, so the upper strata. Okay, and I know this is a lot of information, so I'm going to try to go quite fast over some examples. So on the one hand, a very simple transitive form, which is, let's say, a light bulb, together with a electric circuit, right? So in this case, there's the distinction. It's indeed a electric field gradient, and the form, and in this case, the adjacent form, the adjacent transitive form, is the light bulb. So the light bulb is necessarily sensible to the gradient, and this is by means of some conductive material. And then there's some internal structure by which the electric current is transformed into some electromagnetic radiation, right? So by a process of current turning into heat and heat turning into electromagnetic radiation, yes. And which is finally affected as electromagnetic radiation moving through space. And so in here, the internal structure is transitive. It is highly restrictive. That is, there's only one possible outcome. And so this is a fixed point attractor, right? And so the languages that are involved here are from the most superficial language, which would be macroscopic thermodynamics, up to quantum field theory or whatever, right? But the lowest possible language. And on the other hand, we have this more complex process of bacterial chemotaxis, right? So we have this liquid in which the bacteria is swimming around, and it reads the environment to test for chemical gradients, and it tries to move to the most desirable state. So in this case, the external input is this chemical gradient, and there's this boundary sensibility. There's this sensibility to this external gradient, which is the binding of a ligand to the receptor, which is then translated through some syntactical rules, which are bioelectric impulses, which lead to some internal representation. That is the intracellular signaling cascade that modulates histidine kinase activity. Then there's some coloring. There's the attractant or repellent response, increasing the signaling activity or decreasing it. And then there's prediction down. Well, there's this prediction of, okay, if I go down or up or to any certain direction, there's going to be a lower chemical gradient or a higher chemical gradient, right? So this setups the intention, which is to move down or up, which is then translated into some other biochemical bioelectric impulses, which lead to the flagellar motor rotation. And so once again, here there's a certain boundary conditions which the bacteria can navigate, okay, inside these linguistic spaces to find a certain solution. So in here we're talking about internal structure, which is reflexive and partly restrictive. So not everything is possible, not everything solution is possible. The bacteria cannot do just anything, but there's definitely certain things it can do. So it can swim in one direction or the other, but not in every direction. Not everything is possible, right? And it operates at the border of chaos behavior. It has a border of chaos behavior. Languages are, well, in this case, the most superficial one is physiological, and once again, down to whichever, quantum field theory or whatever. Okay, and to finish, information geometry finally is the formal tool by which the PhD I'm suggesting this can be formalized. So in very short terms, because I'm just running out of time, information geometry is an interdisciplinary field that applies the techniques of differential geometry to study probability theory. So information geometry has very useful tools like Fischer-Rao metric, Kullback-Leibler divergence that helps model by geometric tools this distinction and restriction dynamics. So the idea is the work that I'm trying to put forward now is some geometric Laplacian, which might help model trajectories within the phase space of linguistic, of communication dynamics, right? Yeah, this is where we're going to skip. Okay, to summarize, we've talked about how the history of Western thought is a history of ontological dualism, We've seen how scientific development offers today the means to reconcile these domains. And we have discussed that it is a very profound change. It is a very profound reconstruction of thought. So it requires a great leap of faith. And right now, the project that I did in my master's thesis is an ongoing project, which is still very open and has a lot of work to be done. But so for the PhD, I'm trying to put forward a minimal part of it, which is the basic idea of distinction and restriction in communication processes. And the formal tool that I'm going to try to use to formalize it is information geometry. Okay, so we come to an end. Thank you very much for your time. And yeah, let's open the discussion. Thank you. Okay, Susana, you has your...
Yeah, thank you so much for this amazing presentation, Marco. I think it's fascinating what you just really did in these 45 minutes. You have explained and summarized a lot of things that have happened in history, and then I think created a niche for your research and for yourself, which is very, very interesting, I think. But I have a very brief question for you, for discussion with you and the group, because in the modal categories that you explained, if likelihood, so attunement, right, explains what tends to happen, right? What explains why a system persistently selects one viable trajectory over the others? And I'm thinking about maybe a fifth modal category, orientation. And in the bacterial example, for example, that you explained, in the bacterial chemotaxis, the bacterium sort of does not merely respond to a chemical stimulus or follow the most likely pattern. I think instead, this bacterium selects trajectories that improve conditions for itself. For example, I'm thinking about higher nutrient concentration or whatever, and destabilizes, so to say, those that worsen those patterns. So attunement or likelihood is one of the modal categories, but orientation could be the trajectories that increase nutrient intake and are preferentially stabilized, while others are suppressed. So I don't know if you have thought about it, or if you take those categories from, I don't know, books of history or whatever, but maybe this preference is not representational or cognitive. I mean by this that maybe this category that you could think about is implemented as differential persistence of signaling states over time, and an orientation maybe could introduce a value that is a better or a worse trajectory into the process that you are trying to describe, to direct and adapt the action of the system. Just that.
It is very interesting, Susana, because precisely I was talking about this with a friend yesterday, because the category of attunement had recently been added because Jordi Claramonte had only 3 categories, which were the landscape, the repertoire, and the disposition. And for a long time, I was thinking whether it would make sense to add this fourth category, which is attunement. And for that, I discussed a lot with a friend who's linguistics, and we were discussing about modality in language, right? And at the end, we came to the conclusion that it made sense to include attunement, because there's indeed this predisposition towards things. Like things are not just there's not just a phase space, and there's possibilities. There's predispositions towards some of them, right? Some of them are more likely for any reason. For if there's a mountain and the river has gone through the mountain for hundreds of years, most of the water is going through the channel, because the landscape has been crafted. The landscape has been, what's the word, erosionated. I don't know. So there's a predisposition to follow a certain trajectory. But this example is certainly for transitive processes, right? Because as you said, what about why? And I agree, it makes a lot of sense. And yes, we have discussed about it. Maybe so far it was not considered as a modal aspect, but it was considered it was considered within the internal representational power of the agent. Because yes, there is decision. We do believe that there's this decision power, and in this decision power, you need some internal preference. And for example, another discussion was the minimum free energy principle, right? So according to the free minimum energy principle, systems always try to follow the path in which surprise is going to be minimized.
Yeah.
But then how do you explain, I don't know, so many human behaviors, and not only human behaviors, but so many behaviors in which systems do not follow that path. Systems do crazy stuff. Countries invade other countries, and people suicide, and you have this, I don't know, you have this memes and television programs and so many things that just don't follow the minimum surprise principle. So yes, I think that there's need for these things in any system that tries to describe the world. Yes, and it would make sense. I agree. Yes, I don't know if it would need some reflection whether it's a modal category, but it would make sense, at least to me right now.
Yeah, sure, because landscape is what has happened, is the historical conditioning. Repertoire is what must or may happen because you have constraints. Then disposition is what can happen. So the possibilities space. Attunement is what tends to happen. No, probabilities.
Mm-hmm.
But orientation is what is selected for a purpose. So the why that you are talking about, and I am not sure that is completely transversal to everything and inside the system, but well, I think a kind of reflection over this kind of orientation is needed there. Yeah.
It had to be thought because, for example, these four modal categories apply to any type of agent, also to transitive agents. But I don't know if they could apply. But I don't know if this fifth category could apply to a rock falling down slope. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is why I thought about it, seeing your bacterial example, because there we are talking about living organisms and with a purpose. Even if they are bacteria, they have a purpose too.
Yes,
Thank you, Marco.
An identity and so many things. Yes.
Yeah,
definitely.
Sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So who's okay?
I think I might have put my hand up first. Just a few things. Yeah, on the one hand, I feel like they're like just on a very basic level, like the kind of research I'm doing, and maybe like in this group, etc. I feel like I sense a similarity, and then it's like starts out with these big questions and is very theory heavy, and then kind of tries to fit in a sense into specific examples. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit. But I kind of felt that to some degree, and kind of similarly to that, I feel like there are some things which I understand, and I feel like we're pointing to a lot of the same themes, and at the same time, I did not understand all of it, and there's like a lot that I, did not quite grasp. So on the one hand, I feel like it would be interesting to kind of even, kind of focus or try and build these concepts together that we kind of share in common a lot. I think maybe form might be one of them from this particular presentation. And just a few other comments. When you had mentioned cybernetics, I was reading something the other day where Andrew Pickering described it as anti-disciplinary because it goes against like the disciplinary kind of logic or framework. And I thought that was a kind of an interesting framing. I thought you might resonate with that a little bit. Yeah, and I guess another thing that I wonder if you're kind of including this or considering is that kind of in a lot of Eastern traditions or ways of being, they don't really have this this distinction between epistemology and ontology too much. It's kind of, there's this non-dualism is already kind of a part of a lot of what they do, or a lot of their worldview, or way of being. So I'm curious if in your project you're going to touch on that. And then one last thing, I just kind of related to that Eastern perspective a little more. One kind of potential critique is that, do you think you're kind of reconciling this epistemic and ontic through an epistemic lens? Because it feels very representational, just from what I gathered. So I wonder how you're holding that tension. If you think this reconciliation is still within or reinstalling kind of this tendency to represent. And then, sorry, just one last question. I know there's so many. I'd kind of come across Nicholas Luhmann quite a bit because my research is more social science based. It seems like that kind of is very in line with what you're doing. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts on his framework, and because I didn't see it in your presentation at all, but I don't know. That was a lot, but respond in whatever way that makes sense.
So many questions. About Eastern tradition and the Eastern perspective, yes, there is. It has been present in my mind, at least. I don't know if in the other people inside the group, but definitely my part on it, my participation in it is very much imbued in Eastern thought, because I started to know about all these topics through a professor that I had in Eastern philosophy. And he introduced the course with Chinese classical grammar. And that basically broke apart my entire conception of philosophy. I was like, oh my God, this makes a lot of sense. And what are we going to do with this? So how do I understand the world now that this makes so much sense? So I cannot define the identity of anything without the identities of the others. But then what's identity? Because if everything is interrelated, then what do we get? Where do we go? How do we talk about things? And does it only make sense to not talk about things and hit your students with a stick? So yes, it is definitely on my mental background. I also did a broader paper and master's about relating autopoiesis to the concept of what's it called, the common co-origination, the related co-origination. I don't remember the proper word. So as I said, there's many things that we haven't talked about, but first of all, something that we have to understand is that language is contextual. So nothing can be said out of context, or nothing is true out of its context. And within language, there's also this pragmatics. There is this evolution of language games in Wittgensteinian terms, for example, right? So nothing has its identity isolated, or nothing has this isolated identity out of its relational milieu.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and then about representationality, we do try to avoid it being representational, but there's something that we haven't managed to avoid, and at this point I think it's not avoidable, is that it's always circular. So when you try to describe if you start from non-agensal material and you try to reach agensal material, at the end you realize that non-agensal things are what they are because of agensal things. So electrons, we think of we made these categories, right? So an electron is also a human category within language. And the fact that we have made this category has defined what electrons are doing. So if you have an electric current and if you have a circuit, that means that those electrons are doing what they are doing because we think of them as electrons. So what matter is defined what we think matter is. And I think there's no way to run away from this. At least not that I can think of. So this representational idea is, yes, it is representational, but at the same time it is not, because we understand that representation is only possible by means of pre-existence of, and this is also very maybe Eastern, this idea that there's no need to run away from this from this loop. This representations exist because there's a non-represented stuff, and non-represented stuff exists because there's a, and so on.
Yeah, that's interesting. Probably follow up with more later, but Zan, I know you had a question too.
Well, this is just a slight extension of Sukiko's comments and your comments, Matthew. And at first, I just wanted to say it's a beautiful presentation and just wonderfully logical, and I'll be really fascinated to see where it goes. But with respect to Sukiko's bringing up the bacteria, I think you would find, so Eshel Ben Yaakov was a professor of physics at the Technion University until he had a sudden heart attack 10 years ago in 2015. But he, starting from as a physicist, working on chemotaxis and bacteria, questions like that, he became absolutely fascinated that there was an unpredictable cognitive element in social bacteria and in their ability to sort themselves out as a community, right? And there's now a lot of other work on intelligence at the microbial level, right? And unpredictability at the microbial level. When I get around to doing my presentation, this kind of fundamental distinction is between non-life and life, is that moment of, when the microbe can struggle for existence because they're actually perceiving unpredictabilities in their environment and changing their behavior. Wonderful studies in 1904, I think this was the first study in this category. Jennings, who was working with the single-celled organism Stentor and testing, putting India ink in the water of this organism. Well, this organism had an initial kind of sequence of behaviors to avoid the India ink. But once it tried that sequence and it realized that only the last behavior of, disconnecting from its rock and swimming away, it literally, this single-celled organism could learn and shift its behavior. So I would be fascinated. I think this gets into the Eastern Western questions that Matthew raised as well. And I guess in terms of presentation to the rest of us, it would be really fascinating to see you take this to the next step and show how your very systematic, your system can actually clarify some, real world example in a unique way that, in other words, we would not be able to understand what was going on without plugging it into your system. I'll look forward to that talk in the future. Thanks.
Thanks, Sam. Yes, it's a very interesting question. on the one hand, there's things that are we don't have an answer to yet, or never, but so far we don't. And on the other hand, there's many things that I haven't presented in this talk, right? Because I had say 40 minutes, and so a part that I have omitted is indeed how does memory, learning, and adaptation work, or how can we try to explain this through this system, right? And maybe I once again go to the example of the river falling through the mountain, right? So the landscape that we were talking about has this plasticity. So things that have happened get printed on reality by means of the plasticity of the relations between form. And the crazy thing is that reflexive agents such as our cells, right, or such as bacteria, can read this landscape, and they can reflect on it, and they can learn about the past, and they can predict the future. So they do not only live on the present in this sense and this discrete breath slides sense, right? So even though they do happen at this present moment, they can read the landscape and look back, learn, and memorize this landscape, and they can be creative over what can happen in the future. And
oh, sorry, go ahead.
No. This is.
I would just add one little thing to like landscape modeling, right? And the whole idea of model, then climbing the peak to the optimal, right? The highest peak, but the highest peak turns out to be a dead end, right? And so then you have systems that can actually know that the highest peak is that the so-called optimal solution is non-optimal, right? Because it's a dead end, and that you actually have to navigate to lower peaks, or right. So it's extremely complex, it seems to me.
That's why I also agree that the minimum free energy principle makes a lot of sense, but cannot be enough, because you have this. It cannot be that mechanistic, because you have this, and that's why I also think that the idea of language is beautiful, because the idea that we talk of it as language gives place to semantics, gives place to many things that, even though they can be very formal and they can be scientific, they can be studied in scientific terms, it gives also space to creativity, to fantasy, to fiction, to delirium, and to many other things that you cannot explain by some very deterministic rules, so to say, right? So these bacteria, yes, they are creative. They think of themselves. They are solidary. They help each other, and they find solutions, and they create these higher level of organization minds, right? So they create these societies which have collective intelligence. So they create new language. They are creating this new language. Or, for example, we are a new language that builds on top of bacteria and cells that are working together. And now we are working together under a new level of organization, which is maybe LLMs that are doing something different in a language that we so far don't understand. There must be room for creativity. And that's, I think, beautiful.
Yeah. Huge.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to say two very quick things. First of all, I think that everything is representational. Because, for example, talking about the atom and the atomical system, at the beginning it was explained as a kind of plum cake with the plums in the cake being the atoms, etc. But it didn't work because it was not, the metaphor was very rudimentary, and it was changed by the solar system. So when first the atomical system was described. The plum cake was okay, but then it changed to another kind of representation, another metaphor that was more comprehensible for people. For us now, the atom is something that is very normal and very easy to understand, but it was not so at the beginning. So people needed a metaphor for that. So this is representational. Language is representing everything in our heads, so to say. We need language somehow, not oral language exclusively, but language is needed to put the world into something that can be understood and comprehensible for us. So this is representational per se. And then about plasticity that you were talking about, yes, is the capacity of a system to modify the constraints that govern the transformations as a function of past trajectories, and thereby they are biasing future trajectories. So there is bias in past trajectories versus or towards, I wanted to say, towards future trajectories. So the system does not only change state, but it changes how it can change, because the past has an influence into the future. There is no future without a past and a present. So I think without plasticity, the system can react, it can follow probabilities, it can converge to attractors too, but it cannot learn. So plasticity, I think, is essential for learning. Yeah, and then learning requires that these past forms have structural traces, so to say, so that those traces alter future transformations, as I was saying. And that alteration is plasticity in my mind.
Yeah. So I'm going to answer first to the second thing. So yes, if the medium is, in this case, not the medium, if the landscape of effective forms that have been already objective because they have already happened was not plastic, so if it was totally flexible, indeed, there would be no memory, but not only for systems per se, but for the universe. It could not be consequential to the previous state of things, right? And so this is a lot. I didn't say it, but the scheme of the agent being receptive to the past, transforming to the past distinctions, transforming them and affecting them onto the future, is very much influenced by Whitehead. So Whitehead has this very clever and I think very nice depiction of how the past, present, and future are coherent things, right? So there must be some way of making them coherent. And this is the mechanism that he evolves, to which we added the landscape precisely for this, precisely for there must be some means in which language is imprinted so that the things that happen now have the lexicon, the syntax, the semantics, and the pragmatics of things that have happened before. And this is, so our process is basically constructed by the coherence of that language. So we can talk about processes in time being certain processes because they have this common language. So when you're reading a book, and for example, I don't know if you're reading Don Quixote de la Mancha, when you go reading pages, in every new page, you must remember this, there must be plasticity in your brain to remember the lexicon that has been used. So you need to know that Don Quixote is the main character, that he's this guy that has this delirium, that he is a medieval hero, and so on and so forth, right? So, yeah. And as for representation, Yes, but it is representation. But I think that the interesting thing here is that representation is layered. So semantics work as strata, right? So something has meaning only in the upper level of organization. So this is the Matryoshka type of representation in which at the end everything is a representation, and at the same time it is the syntax. So at the same time it is semantic and it is syntactic. So the semantics of an upper level become the syntax of the next upper level, which is quite complex to understand, but I promise it makes sense. I'll try to explain maybe this at some other time, how this strata stratification of language work and so on. But yeah, I agree, Suki.
I'm sorry, I really don't want to bother. Unfortunately, I need to go. It was a real pleasure to participate in today's meeting, and I wish you a fruitful continuation of the discussion. I'll see you soon. Bye bye.
Bye, Olga.
You.
Bye, Olga.
Joe, you have your hand raised.
Yes, just some comments and some realizations over the discussion over the past few minutes. It just occurred to me, well, and also some sharing. When I was in high school, I always thought that, we have language, but I can actually invent my own language, but I don't do that because I have to conform to society, for example. I can call a cat a dog, say cat, but I mean dog for myself, but nobody would understand me, something like that. So anyway, just a thought that we're talking about language, but for example, on the bacteria or chemotaxi, and what you just said about uh, uh, one level becoming the lexicon, becoming the syntax for, or the other way around for the next level. Just being a biologist before, it just occurred to me that for bacteria, for example, they communicate via chemical signals. And all this time I was thinking about the mechanistic, how they communicate. Like one bacteria would secrete this particular chemical that is, the other bacteria has evolved to be receptive to that particular chemical. And then its system, its organization, uh, responds to that signal in a particular way. And that sort of makes the whole community of bacteria become cooperative to each other or antagonistic to each other. And it just occurred to me that, hey, that chemical signals are their language. It's not necessarily just the signal, it's a language to themselves. And also there's a concept called epigenetics in genetics, wherein your DNA is modified chemically, and it's that modification is passed on to offspring, and it in a way passes on behavioral traits, like for example how a particular organism, or maybe I don't know, not a very good example perhaps, but how certain behaviors of offspring can be observed between a child and a mother in humans, for example. And that can be traced back to the epigenetic modifications of your genes. And that also carries down to the structural mechanisms that how these genes are accessed by the transcription factor, the processes at the level of the genes that affect how behavior and how essentially chemical processes within your body that eventually translate into behavioral phenotypes or behavioral things that can be observed. So those are, just realize that those are levels of communication that carry up to something that are emergent in effect. So your chemical processes that can be mechanistic from a scientist's point of view are actually emergent properties at a higher level, like observing behavior patterns or uh, some other phenotypes or some other characteristics that can be observed at a different level. So thanks. I learned a lot from your talk.
Thank you. That's amazing to hear. And yes, indeed, I think you understood very well what linguistic strata is intended to describe. So, in any communication process, many level of organizations happen at the same time, right? So when you have me talking through a screen in the screen of your computer, a lot of things are happening. And on the one hand, you have, for example, the semantic level of we are using our human language through these computers and we understand what we say and these words have meaning to us. But you also have these physiological things, physiological processes inside of us. So you have a heart which is pumping blood, and you have the blood reaches my lips and my muscles, which allow me to articulate my mouth, and thanks to it, I can produce this human language statements, right? And for those to work, you also need some, let's say, chemical processes of oxygen transmission through the membranes of the cells, and this interchange of I don't know, potassium and calcium and everything that happens in the cell membrane and so on and so forth, right? And this is at the same time a molecular process, which is being produced which is being articulated through the molecular language. So there's these electrons that are being interchanged by these electrochemical boundary conditions. And at the same time, this is an electromagnetic process. It's an electromagnetic language, because this happens because of these stability regimes on the orbits of the electrons on the nucleus around the nucleus and so on, right? That's why I said and you can keep on going. Doesn't matter until when, but you can, I guess, stop at quantum field theory or whatever is the deepest theory of the universe that we know at this moment. But yes, and all of them converts to one thing. Like all of them must be coherent, because the objective, like what happens is it's actually one thing and not many. So your cellular language cannot be doing something different to your molecular language, but it's not the same. So the syntax is not the same, the semantics are not the same, the lexicon is not the same. So this is the idea of the strata. So for example, when you have when there's an earthquake on the surface of the earth, you see something very specific on the surface, but there's many different layers doing many different things throughout the inner part of the earth, but they converge to just one result, right? And this is also a process of sedimentation of the landscape. So this is also like Jordi Claramonte. This is idea of Jordi. He has this very beautiful way of using terms that have this second term that then they make sense because of what they are, right? So the landscape, he thought of the idea of the landscape from the Spanish word paisaje, and paisaje comes from paisano, which is the person who works on the landscape, right? So it's the person who modifies the landscape by means of work, by means of exerting some work onto it. And the same for strata. So the idea of strata is precisely this. Yeah. Well, nice.
Yeah, I was going to raise the point of everything can be explained by going down to the quantum physics, but yeah, maybe it doesn't stop at the quantum physics level. Maybe there's a deeper or more smaller thing that you can go smaller and smaller and smaller. Yeah.
Very likely. I think it, yeah. But at this point, I was very interested in fundamental physics at some point in my life. But when I discover complex systems theory, I stopped being that interested because I realized that why would you have just that specific interest on the lowest level of organization, which is so old that it's almost non-creative, like almost nothing new happens on that level. No new fundamental particles are just come to existence on that level, right? And the intuition I have about this is that because it is the lowest level, so whatever happens on top of it must be coherent with this. So there's very few things that this can do, right? It's the base of the building, so you cannot do many things with it. So why would you have this? No, of course you can have this. I find it super interesting, but now I see that there's so many different levels of organization that are super amazing and super interesting, and I think that all of them are as legit and as important to study.
Yes, and it makes me now wonder what's the higher organizations. What are the different levels higher up?
Well, that's already theology. God, right? or some form of I don't know. But there's definitely the possibility for thinking about God as well. Yes.
Yeah, God as the uppermost layer, where the semantics of God does not give rise to another syntax, different syntax.
Well, people, so let's leave it here.
Yeah, that sounds good with me. Let me stop the recording. Okay.